Hello, Woodland stewards. My name is Marne Titchenell. I am the Extension Program Specialist in Wildlife in the School of Environment and Natural Resources, which is part of the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences. I'm glad you decided to join me today to learn a little bit more about Ohio bats. So in this video, we're going to talk about the life of bats, their habitat requirements, and some of the current challenges bat populations are facing. Let's get started. First, I'll share a bit about my background with bats. I have been educating on bats for many years now, but before then I had the chance to study Ohio bats for my graduate degree. I worked in state forests in southern Ohio, assessing the impacts of harvesting on bat populations. I used several different types of equipment to collect my data. And so there is a picture of what is called a bat detector. And these devices are placed out, in my case, in the woods, and they record echolocation calls of bats. And this is how we record or gather acoustic bat activity. Here is a picture of a mist net. And here is a bat caught in that mist net. So this is how we gather bat capture data. So later in the presentation, I will likely refer to bat activity and capture data. And so I wanted to give you a visual of how that information and how that data is collected. Bats belong to the order called Chiroptera. They're classified into their own order specifically due to their unique morphology and ability of flight. So below in that picture on the bottom left, you can see a bat's wing. And maybe you're noticing how it is made up of elongated fingers. So in fact, the word Chiroptera means hand wing. There are over 1,390 species of bats worldwide, but here in Ohio, we have 10 species. Now, all of our Ohio bats belong to the family Vespertilionidae, which is one of the largest, most widespread and diverse of all of the bat families. All of our bats here in Ohio feed on insects. And because bats need to consume at least 50% of their body weight each night, which is closer to 100% if the bat is pregnant or lactating, their largest ecological and economic value lies within their tremendous appetite for night-flying insects. And because we are already seeing 30% loss of U.S. crops due to pests, this is an important service that bats are providing us. Now, there have been several studies that have attempted to determine exactly how many insects bats are actually eating out there on the landscape. And so one study reported that 150 big brown bats consumed over 1 million insects per year. Another study attempted to attach a monetary value to what bats are saving us in pesticide application costs. And you can see those figures are very high. Now, how are bats finding all of those insects out there on the landscape? That is when they are using echolocation. So no, they are not out there singing Sweet Caroline. They are essentially yelling out these calls that bounce off of objects in the environment, in this case, an insect. And when that echo comes back to that bat, it essentially gets a visual image of that insect. It's really incredible what bats can do with their ability of echolocation. Despite the value bats provide us, one of the biggest challenges of bat conservation is getting people to see bats first and foremost for the value they provide, and not falling prey to negative stereotypes or very real fear and dislike. Bats are often thought of as dirty, diseased animals. Now, I can say that, I've handled many bats, and aside from some munched up beetles stuck in their teeth, I have never encountered a dirty bat. They groom themselves constantly, so they are not dirty animals. However, when it comes to disease, yes, bats have been found to harbor diseases. Thankfully, their unique immune system keeps those diseases at bay. They have also been long associated with rabies. And this is something we do need to be aware of, since bats sometimes share our living spaces. The good news is that the prevalence of rabies is low within our bat populations. Still, we need to never handle bats, and if handling is required, we need to be sure we're wearing thick gloves to protect ourselves from bites. We also need to make sure that we are keeping our pets vaccinated for rabies and submitting bats for testing if an exposure occurs. Over the years, I have been working with and educating about bats, and I have noticed an upswing of engaged and supportive citizens towards bat management and conservation, which is very heartening and very much needed. Right now, more than half of the bat species in the United States are suspected to be in decline, and several are already listed as endangered or threatened. Losses in bats populations are occurring at alarming rates worldwide. Now, here in Ohio and the United States, bat populations are being impacted in many ways, as you can see here. So habitat loss is occurring anytime, could potentially occur anytime a tree is removed. Colony disturbance, whether it's disturbance by humans or disturbance to summer roost sites. Mortality in our highly migratory bats is occurring due to collisions with wind turbines. And bats are being impacted by disease themselves. The most deadly and most recent is white nose syndrome, which we will talk about later. And there are other factors as well. When you talk to rehabilitation centers, for example, predation is the top reason for most bats being submitted for care. I want to use the annual activity patterns of bats as a general outline for the rest of this talk. I've found that with the general public, there are a lot of unknowns and questions about where bats are spending their time throughout the year. For example, many people largely associate bats with cave environments. However, it's important to realize that many of our species of bats here in Ohio and the eastern US use caves only during hibernation. In addition, we have several species of bats that do not use caves at all. The remainder of the year is spent in a variety of different habitats, but mostly forests. So let's start by discussing how bats spend their time during April through September. This is the time of year when they are actively foraging for food on usually a nightly basis, and it's also the time of year when they are birthing and raising pups. So let's talk about where our bats are birthing and raising their young. Many bat biologists group bats into those that are solitary roosting and those that are colonial. So I'll just back up and explain roosting. Roosting is when an animal is at rest. So our solitary bats, and you're seeing some of our different Ohio species here. So we have the eastern red bat, and this is one of my favorite species of bats because it is the only one here in Ohio where the males and females look different. So here we have our male eastern red bat, and then here we have our female eastern red bat. Below that we have our hoary bat and our silver-haired bat. So these are not species that you would expect to see in a building or a bat house. They roost alone in the canopies of trees. They don't use caves for overwintering, and so they're not among the species that are generally impacted by white nose syndrome. They are, however, migratory. So this is a group of bats that is being impacted by wind energy. And so the bat that you're looking at in the right side is a great example of what these bats look like when they're roosting during the daytime. And this is the hoary bat. And no, this bat is not named for being an overly promiscuous bat, although bats really are promiscuous. It's named for hoarfrost. And if you can notice on that fur, it's kind of tipped with white. Nowadays, we just call it frost. And then we have our colonial bats. And these are the bats I think folks are more familiar with. These are the species that form colonies in trees, both live and dead trees. They also form colonies in other various places, including buildings and bat houses. So these colonies, when I say a bat colony, I'm referring to something called a maternity colony. So when you have a colony of bats, whether it's in a tree, in an attic, or a barn, or in a bat house, it is females that have gathered together to birth and raise their young, and their young are called pups. Of these species, and here we have the little brown bat, we have the big brown bat, and those are the two species most often found in homes and in bat houses. And then below them we have the northern long-eared bat and the Indiana bat. And these two, if you can tell, are kind of boxed out in red, and that is because these are state and federally listed species. So the northern long-eared is state and federally listed as threatened, and the Indiana bat is state and federally listed as endangered. So during the winter, these species undergo migrations to caves or abandoned mines to hibernate, and these are the species that are being impacted by white nose syndrome. We do have a few more colonial bats that I wanted to touch on. So in the upper left corner, we have the evening bat, which kind of looks like a miniature big brown bat. It is also a migratory bat, and it's rarely encountered here in Ohio. The small-footed bat is another little brown bat, but slightly darker in coloration, and it has a black face mask and ears. It does form maternity colonies, sometimes under rocks, and it also hibernates in caves. And then lastly, we have the tricolored bat. They form smaller maternity colonies, and a lot of times those colonies are in dead leaf clusters, but they will also use dead trees and buildings like you see in that bottom picture. It's one of our smallest Ohio bats. It does hibernate in caves, and it's another species that is being heavily impacted by white nose syndrome. So now that we know where bats go to roost and raise their young, let's talk a little bit about their reproductive patterns. Bats practice delayed fertilization. So what that means is that mating takes place in the fall, and the females do not start gestation until the spring. Now there is some variation in strategies across species, but the ultimate goal is to delay birth until the time of year when food is most plentiful. So here is how it typically plays out during the calendar year. In April, the female bats are arriving at their roost sites, and by May and June, all of our Ohio species are giving birth to young. Now, depending on the species, they can have anywhere from 1 to 3 pups, though usually it's 1. And those pups are born at 20 to 30% of the mother's weight. Let's stop and think about that for a second. That would mean if I were a mother bat, I would give birth to a 35-pound baby. Now, by July and August, the pups are further developed. They have learned how to fly, and they're out and about eating insects. One final thing I want to stress is that bats are reproducing only this one time per year. You might think, given their small size, that they would reproduce multiple times and maybe have multiple young per litter. But bats live a very long time. Little brown bats have been found to live as many as 30 years. And so it works for them in sustaining their populations to only reproduce once per year. Unfortunately, what this means is that if bat populations suffer major declines, it can take them a very long time to recover. Okay, let's complete our journey through a year in the life of a bat by looking at what they're doing from October through March. Remember our solitary bats, those that don't form colonies? Outside of the growing season, they are highly migratory. Some undergo long migrations to warm areas where they remain active, like our hoary bats. Others migrate and then become inactive. And so what you're looking at on the right side of the screen is a picture of a red bat hibernating on the forest floor within the leaf litter. So I'll just kind of circle them here so you can see exactly who we're looking at here. There is quite a bit we still don't know about the migrational journeys of bats, and it's a big area of research right now. But what we do know is that these are the bats being impacted by wind turbines. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. Here you are looking at Ohio bat mortalities at wind turbines. We see that red bats, hoary bats, and silver-haired bats have had the highest mortalities. Some of our other bat species have also been killed by wind turbines, but they make up a much smaller percentage. So it's our migratory solitary bats that are at the most risk. Now, research from other parts of the country report estimates that are just as serious as what we are seeing. For example, it is predicted that if we continue to develop wind energy at the rate we are, there may be a 90% decline in our hoary bat populations over the next 50 years. Additionally, recent research out of Ohio has found evidence that hoary bat declines that support Frick and others' predictions. Now, obviously, this is a concern because we don't want to not explore and create clean energy. So it is a challenge. The good news is that there are ways to mitigate bat mortality with turbines. And one of the most effective options right now is slowing the turbine rotation speed during prime migration nights for bats. So this tends to be during low wind speed nights, which would mean it wouldn't have been a highly productive night for the turbine anyways. However, slowing the turbine does mean that there is a drop in production, and that does create a challenge when working with companies to adopt these practices. Fortunately, many of our companies here in Ohio are complying. Okay, we've looked at our solitary bats. Now let's conclude with our colonial bats. These are the species that, once again, are hibernating in caves or mines. And that is when they are coming in contact with white nose syndrome. So white nose syndrome, this is a disease of cave hibernating bats. It is being caused by a non-native invasive fungus, the origin likely from Europe, and it appears on the bodies of infected bats. In this picture, you can see the white nose, and those are the fruiting bodies of the fungus. You can also see that those white fruiting bodies on the ears, on the wings, and any other exposed surfaces or skin of the bat. How is this fungus killing bats? First of all, normal, healthy bats arouse every so often during hibernation. But infected bats are waking up more often than they should, causing them to burn through their energy reserves before winter is over. The disease also causes water loss. So some bats will succumb to the disease and die in the caves. Others may leave the cave in search of food and water in the middle of winter and subsequently die when those resources are not able to be found. So we are seeing a very high mortality rate among bats that are infected, and the disease has spread very rapidly across the country. Here in Ohio, it is causing mortality in 6 of our 10 species. Let's look a little bit at that spread of the disease. So here is the current spread of white nose syndrome. It was first discovered during the winter of 2006 and 2007 in New York, and I'm circling that right here so you can kind of see it a little bit better. And since then, it has spread in, if you're following the colors, reverse rainbow colors across the country to 38 states and 7 Canadian provinces. It arrived in Ohio during the winter of 2011, and it was found on the West Coast in 2016, which unfortunately was 15 years ahead of what was predicted. So how is it spread? It's spread bat to bat. It can also be spread through the movement of fungal spores. So people moving in and out of infected caves can move those spores to uninfected sites. White nose syndrome is one of the most devastating wildlife epidemics in recorded history due to the rapid spread and high mortality rates. These mortality rates are roughly 70 to 100% in the caves and mines where it is being found. So let's take a look at some of those mortality rates. Now, as part of monitoring bat populations, especially in light of white-nose syndrome, bat biologists routinely enter hibernacula to do population counts of bats. So a hibernacula is a place where an animal hibernates. So in this case, we're talking about caves and mines. This data that you're looking at is the result of those counts over the years. And as you're probably seeing, there is a rather apparent and serious trend of decline. So in New York, they noted that, or they reported that little brown bat populations within 5 hibernacula declined 88 to 95%. In Virginia, 4 years after white-nose syndrome was found in caves, they reported declines of 99% in little brown bats and almost 90% in tricolored bats. And when we look at Indiana bat statewide declines through the years of white-nose syndrome being here in the United States, the declines are just as serious. And when we look at some of Ohio's hibernacula, we are seeing those same declines. So this is just information from 2 caves here in Ohio where bats are hibernating. One, we've seen an overall 99.3% decline in the bat population, and in another, we have seen an almost 85% decline. Here is capture data from Ohio looking at little brown bats, northern long-eared bats, and tricolored bats. So remember, capture data is from MISNet surveys taking place during the summer. So the capture rates of these 3 species combined has declined 96% from 2010 to 2018. For some of those species, the hibernacula survey reports are as serious as 99%. Now, because of these declines, we are seeing proposed changes to our state endangered and threatened species list. So in Ohio, right now, all of our species of bats are protected. They are listed as species of concern, except, of course, our Indiana bat, which is state endangered, and our northern long-eared bat, which is state threatened. So there are proposed changes that would upgrade several species. The northern long-eared bat, the little brown bat, and the tricolored bat would become endangered. I'll also note that these same species are all currently being assessed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife for listing under the Endangered Species Act. Now, some good news. There's a lot of research being conducted working to identify tools that can be used to help protect bats impacted by white-nose syndrome. And it's likely going to be a combination of these tools that will ultimately help bats fight the disease. At the same time, it is critical that human transfer of the fungus is reduced. So many caves on public lands have already been closed or gated to keep people out. Researchers that are working with bats are required to follow strict decontamination procedures and follow equipment restrictions. And one more thing I want to make note of. So the fungus that causes white-nose syndrome is a cold-loving fungus. That's why it grows so well in cool, moist cave conditions. However, research has found that the fungus continues to live in these cave conditions even if it's summertime. So the fungus can still be picked up and transported by people visiting contaminated sites during the summertime. So it's just best to stay out of these caves and mines year-round. In the time I have left, I wanted to give you a little snapshot of some of the research going on around white-nose syndrome. In that first bullet point there, you see that the invasion by PD, which is the fungus that causes white-nose syndrome, has led to a shift in the microbiota of bats. So what does that mean? Well, it means that some of the bats that have survived infection have been found with beneficial bacteria on their wings. And so that can help to protect them against future invasions. We've also found that other microbes, such as bacteria, can inhibit the growth of PD. And there's also evidence, a little bit, of bat resistance to white-nose syndrome. So one study reported that bats that went into hibernation with more energy reserves and woke up less during hibernation were better able to survive the winters in those infected caves. So let's hear it for the fat, sleepy bats. Now, there is also anecdotal evidence that bats are changing their hibernation behaviors and moving to colder areas of the cave where PD can't survive. So it's important to note that even though PD is a cold-loving fungus, it does still have its limitations and can't survive in temperatures that are too cold. And one piece of information, which is good news, really good news, is that some species of bats are not being impacted as greatly by white nose syndrome as others. Big brown bats are one such species. There are several reasons for this, but one that researchers are looking into more currently is that it seems the entire big brown bat population does not hibernate in caves and mines. Some are being found in above ground sites hibernating. I actually had the chance to see this last December, and so I want to share a quick video of what was found. In this video, you're going to be looking at a cliff wall, so above ground, with a crevice in it. Pretty cool, huh? So that was a big brown bat just snoozing away. There's also evidence of other species using non-traditional sites for hibernacula. Little brown bats, for example, have been found using railway tunnels during the winter. So exciting findings for sure. So what are some things that we as homeowners, landowners, and woodland owners can do to help bats? So these first two are, of course, in light of white nose syndrome. Respect the cave closers and report unusual behavior, such as bats flying around in the middle of winter. You can manage woodlands for bats, and in just a minute I will have a slide with more information that'll take you to some fact sheets and some really good publications to help you do that. We can also put up bat houses or maternity roost houses. And the website that just popped up there is the website for Bat Conservation International, and it is a very good source of information for all things related to bat houses. And I do realize that, a lot of this talk was about raising awareness of bats and their importance, but I am not going to tell somebody that they should have to live with bats if they don't want to. So there are professionals out there that will safely exclude bats from your home. And so bat exclusion allows bats to safely exit the house and not re-enter. And it is the #1 and most effective solution to remove bats from buildings. And for all you woodland owners or managers out there, if you're interested in managing your woods for bats, check out these resources. Also, feel free to get in touch with me and we can chat further about it. Even if you are unable to do any of the things that I just mentioned, efforts to educate the general public and raise awareness of bats are incredibly important. So please share what you have learned. Even if it's just one thing, share it with a friend or a neighbor, and I know you all will. To that note, I do want to share an opportunity to learn even more. So National Bat Week is every year from October 24th through the 31st. And this website, www.batweek.org, has some great resources posted on it. And as of 2019, Ohio has officially recognized Bat Week. So every year, bat educators around the state are going to organize events during Bat Week. Where can you find more information about those events? Ohio also has its own bat working group, and we've just created our own Facebook page. So I encourage you to follow our page, and you can see the link at the bottom of the slide here, for some great Ohio-related bat info, as well as updates on upcoming. Here are some additional resources. That first one, the Fish and Wildlife Service White Nose Syndrome page, is my go-to source of white nose syndrome information. And it has the spread maps that I shared with you if you want to stay up to date on that. Also has some great information on current research. Bat Conservation International, that's also a very good site for all things bat related. That is the site I tend to send folks to, though, if they have questions about bat houses. So lots of good information about bat houses there. Of course, there's Ohio Woodland Stewards. Please come and keep checking back. We are going to continue to offer lots of new online content, and we have some really exciting webinars coming up as well. And then last but not least is the batweek.org website. Also a really cool site to get ideas on how you can help bats here in Ohio. And they also have some great resources for educators on that site as well. So thank you all so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed learning more about Ohio bats. And until next time, bye-bye.